welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. We find ourselves yet again in another December, which means it's time for the final installment in another calendar blanket project. This year, our 2024 Granny's Magical Cupboard series found us making granny squares every month, and December is no exception. Now, we do have one more video coming on the border, but as you know, if you've done these along with us before, you can have a little bit of free range when it comes to joining and adding borders to our square style calendar blankets, and this year's no exception. Now, if you're following along, like I said, we will have a border tutorial that's specific to this square blanket, but you can add a border if you like, if you're in a hurry to get the whole thing finished. We will have that tutorial out for you ASAP. But before we get there, we have one more square, and that is the Bean Garden Granny Square. We wanted to introduce the bean stitch for the 12th and final square this year. The bean stitch is really fun. You're basically just cramming a whole bunch of loops into the same place before you crochet them all together. And because it's a bit of a chonky stitch, we wanted to offset it with something a little lighter, the V-stitch. So this square only takes up about 45 yards, about 5 more than the average square in this series, and it's a lot of fun and it's relatively quick to do. So if you're in a hurry to get done, this is not a heavy-duty square. I'm going to do it in 3 colors, my typical blue, yellow, white colorway that I've been doing. I'm going to show you how you can change colors at the end of every row or any row, or how to not change colors if you just want to do it in a solid color. So it's sort of the same thing. The stitch count per side per row is the same as every other square in the series, which is why it fits in with the rest of the squares in this series. And it's just basically a lot of fun. If you've never made the bean stitch, it's a fun little project. And we have one more project here on the channel that uses the bean stitch. I'll link it in the description box down below. It's the bean stitch chonky beanie that we did a few years ago. And that's a really nice little hat. If you're looking for a new hat pattern and you like the bean stitch, you might like that tutorial. So we'll link it down below for you. All right, let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn. We'll head on over to the craft table and we will stitch up the Bean Garden Granny Square together. For this month's square, we're going to use around 45 yards of yarn. I'm using a size 4 medium weight acrylic in 3 colors, but of course you can use any combination of colors that you like. You can make it in a solid color, you can make it in stripes like me, it's entirely up to you, but in total you'll need about 45 yards. You're going to want a pair of scissors, a yarn needle. I recommend stitch markers, 4 of them, 1 for each chain 2 corner to keep track of them, and I'm using a 5.5 millimeter hook. This is also known as an eye or a 9. And once you've got all that together, we can get started. We're going to begin with our middle color. I'm starting with yellow. We're going to make a slip knot and chain 5. Once you've chained 5, you're going to join with a slip stitch to the first chain to make a ring, and all of the stitches in row 1 will be worked into this ring. I'm going to work over my short tail, but you can leave yours out and weave it in later. We are going to make V-stitches in our first row. We're going to chain 4 to begin. The chain 4 at the beginning of every row in this pattern counts as a double crochet, chain 1. Double crochet into the ring, and that's our first V-stitch. So the chain 4 counts as a double crochet, chain 1, and then a double crochet right after that gives us a V-stitch. Chain 2 for a corner, and we make a V-stitch. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So double crochet, chain 1, double crochet is a V-stitch. Before we go any further, I highly recommend putting a stitch marker on that chain 2 corner. It will help you keep track of what's a corner and what's a V-stitch. Chain 2, that's the new corner, corner number 2, and we make another V-stitch. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. Again, before you go any further, I highly recommend that you put a stitch marker on that chain 2 corner space. Chain 2, that's corner number 3, and a V-stitch. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. Once again, find that that corner you just made, put a stitch marker on it so you can differentiate between it and your V-stitch, and then we're going to chain 2 more. That's our 4th corner, and that brings us back to the beginning. V-stitch, corner, V-stitch, corner, V-stitch, corner, V-stitch, new corner with the chain 2. Find the third stitch of the chain 4 and slip stitch to join. Again, you might want to put your 4th stitch marker into that corner, and it's also helpful to kind of put it down, pull out those 4 corners. Just going to make sure that doesn't look too loose. Pull out the 4 corners. Make sure you've got the chain 2 corners all marked with your 4 stitch markers so you can easily see the 4 V-stitches that make up the first row. If you want to change colors at the end of this row or any row, once you've joined with a slip stitch to the 3rd chain of the chain 4, and every row will be joined that way, you'll always end with a slip stitch in the 3rd chain of the chain 4. You can fasten off if you want to change colors and join your new color with a slip stitch in the next chain 2 corner space. If you're not changing colors, you want to slip stitch across to that. Slip stitch into the middle of the V-stitch, slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet, so that gets you across the V-stitch, and then you can slip stitch into the chain 2 corner space. So either way, we all want to start in a chain 2 corner every single row. So if you are not changing colors, you slip stitch across to it, slip stitch into that space and get ready. If you are changing colors, just fasten off once you've joined your row, join your new color with a slip stitch over here in the chain 2 corner. So we all start in a chain 2 corner. Every row begins with a chain 4. Chain 4 counts as a double crochet chain 1, and we double crochet into the corner space. Chain 2, and before we leave that corner, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch in every single chain 2 corner. V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch. Every corner gets that, every single row. The row begins with a chain 4. Chain 4 counts as a double crochet chain 1, and the double crochet you make immediately after that completes the first V-stitch. Chain 2 for the new corner, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, that's a V-stitch. Here's where we start adding in bean stitches. Bean stitches are so much fun. They're a nice thick little sort of chubby kind of a stitch, and they're basically made by making a whole bunch of loops in the same place. So into the middle of every V-stitch going forward, the middle of every V-stitch, which is a chain 1, you're going to work a bean stitch. Yarn over, pick up a loop in that V-stitch, the middle of the V-stitch, yarn over again, pick up another loop in the V-stitch, yarn over again, pick up another loop in your V-stitch. You're going to have 7 loops on your hook. So here's your working loop. First yarn over, first picked up loop, second yarn over, second picked up loop, third yarn over, third picked up loop. So that's 7 loops on your hook. Yarn over, pull back through everything, and you get this really cute chubby little bean. Now there's a lot of ways to make a bean stitch. This is one variant that we're going to use, and we're not doing an extra chain afterwards because we only want the one stitch. That's the stitch we create by making that bean stitch. We're not doing any extra chains or anything. All right, that brings us to our next chain 2 space, and the chain 2 corner space gets V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch. So double crochet, chain 1, chain 2, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So I should say double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, chain 2. Mark that chain 2 corner with your stitch marker. So double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, chain 2, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch. Definitely put your stitch marker back in that chain 2 space before you leave. And here we go. We are looking at a V-stitch from the previous row, and into the middle of that we want to make a bean stitch. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop. You've got 7 loops on your hook. Yarn over, pull back through everything, and a little chubby bean is what you get. And you have 1 loop, 1 stitch running across the top. We are up to our next corner space, so we're going to work a V-stitch, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, the corner, chain 2, and another V-stitch. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch. That's the corner. Put your stitch marker back in the chain 2 corner. It really does help differentiate between the corners and the V-stitches. That brings us up to another V-stitch from the previous row. Into the middle, we're going to work a bean stitch, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pull back through everything. Chubby bean, I love it. Into the last corner, we're going to work a V-stitch, chain 2, and into the same corner, a V-stitch. V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch in every single corner, every single row. Whoops. And before you leave, put that stitch marker back in your chain 2 corner. That leaves us with the last V-stitch from the previous row. We want to put in one more bean stitch in the middle of it. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pull back through everything. And that is the 4th bean stitch of row 2. That brings us right back to the chain 4 that began the whole row. Find the 3rd chain and slip stitch to join. If you are not changing colors, slip stitch into the chain 1 space, slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet, and slip stitch into the chain 2 space, and hold your horses. If you are changing colors, I'm just going to put that back, then you've joined your row, you can fasten off, grab your next color, and get ready to join in the next chain 2 space, which is right here. You might want to take a moment to square up your square, sort of pull out those corners, maybe weave in the tail or get ready to work over top of it. It's entirely up to you. And that is rows 1 and 2 of our new square complete. And I've got my new color now. I'm going to put a slip knot on my hook and I'm going to join with a slip stitch in the first chain 2 corner space. It's the same place you will be sitting waiting if you did not change colors. Every row begins the same way, and this pattern is very much the same thing from here on out. So if it's a V-stitch you come up against, you want to work a bean stitch into the middle of it. And if you come up against a bean stitch, you're going to work a V-stitch into the top of it. But I'll show you what that looks like. So let's get started. In the chain 2 corner to begin, we're going to chain 4. Chain 4 counts as a double crochet, chain 1, double crochet once more into that corner space. That's your first V-stitch of the row. Chain 2 and double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So that's V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch to begin the row. Going to keep track of those chain 2 corners with a stitch marker. First thing we come to is a V-stitch from the previous row, so we want to work a bean stitch into the top of it. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, 7 loops on your hook, yarn over, pull back through everything. Now we've come to a bean stitch. How do you figure that it's a bean stitch? You can sort of see that chubby little bean built into the V-stitch from the row before. The top of this stitch sits just to the right if you're working right-handed. It'll sit just to the left if you're working left-handed. So this is the top of the stitch right here, and that's where we want to work a new V-stitch. So we're going to work right into the stitch part, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So V-stitch, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet into the top of the bean, and the top of that bean stitch sits just to the right. Again, if you're working right-handed, meaning you're going to the right. If you're working left-handed, then it will sit just to the left. This right here is actually the top of this double crochet, which is part of this V-stitch. So ignore that, even though it looks like it's sitting on top of your bean kind of sits to the side. So that's the top of the bean stitch. This is the next V-stitch, and into the V-stitch we work a new bean. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pull back through everything. I'll look after that little tail later. So there's the V-stitch, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, the new bean stitch, and that is the top of it right there. That brings us to a chain 2 corner. This is why these stitch markers are so helpful. You can tell it's a chain 2 corner not only because it's the corner, but there was a stitch marker in it, so I don't have to think so hard. The corners get V-stitch, chain 2, and V-stitch. I've put my stitch marker back in the chain 2 corner. I want to keep track of that. And here I go along the next side. I'm looking at a V-stitch, so that means I make a bean. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pull back through everything. Now I've come up against a bean stitch. So let's really pull this apart and take a look at it. That's the middle of the V-stitch. I just put a bean in there. This is obviously the bean stitch. It's that little chubby little stitch. The top of it, which is right here, sits just to the right because I'm working right-handed. Even though this looks like the top of the bean stitch, it's not. It's actually the top of the double crochet right next to it. Again, if you're working left-handed, this will be in reverse. This is where I want to put my V-stitch. So I see the bean, I look for the stitch just to the right. That's the top of the bean stitch. Remember, your bean stitch is actually sitting on a bit of an angle. Then I look for the next V-stitch. I'm concentrating on where that V-stitch is because I want the middle of it. Put in a bean. That brings me up to a corner. V-stitch. Chain 2 and V-stitch. Before I leave, I'm going to put that stitch marker in so I can help keep track of things. And it's the same thing. I've got a V-stitch, a bean, and a V-stitch. That means I have to do a bean, a V-stitch, and a bean. So if you're looking at a V-stitch, you put a bean in the middle of it. If you're looking at a bean, you want to put a V-stitch in the top of it. Remember that the top of the stitch is just to the right if you're right-handed, just to the left if you're working left-handed. The next thing is a V-stitch. Pull it apart if you're confused. Look for the middle, that's the chain 1 space in the middle, and put in a bean. You arrive at another corner. Thank goodness for the stitch markers. V-stitch, chain 2, and V-stitch. Before I leave, I want to put my stitch marker back in, and that leaves me with one side left. There's my V-stitch, the bean, and the V-stitch. Put a bean in the middle of the V. There's my bean. Put a V-stitch in the top of the bean. And a V-stitch. Last thing, I need a bean for the V-stitch. So beans in the V's, V's in the beans. That brings me up to the chain 4 that began the row. I find the third chain of the chain 4, slip stitch to join. If you're changing colors, fasten off, join with a new yarn in the chain 2 corner space with a slip stitch. If you're not changing colors, slip stitch into the chain 1 space, slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet, and slip stitch into the chain 2 space. So we all start in a chain 2 space. At the end of row 3, you'll have 2 bean stitches per side and 3 V stitches per side, plus your chain 2 corners. But that still is the same stitch count as every other square in the series. So row 1 would have 3 stitches across each side, row 2 would have 7 stitches across each side, Row 3 will have 11 stitches across each side, and you can count. A V-stitch has 3 stitches in it, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, and a bean stitch is only 1. So 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, or 11 stitches. We don't count chains in the chain 2 corners because they are consistent throughout. So 3 per side, 7 per side, 11 per side at the end of row 3. Row 4 and every row hereafter looks exactly the same, and you can make this square as big as you want or as small as you want by increasing or decreasing the number of rows you use. I'm going to do 6 rows in total. Row 4, like every other row, begins with a chain 4. Chain 4 counts as a double crochet, chain 1. Double crochet once more into that chain 2 corner. Chain 2 for the new corner, and double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, or V-stitch, chain 2 V-stitch. Before I leave, I put my stitch marker back in so I keep track of that corner. The first thing I come to will be a V-stitch. I want to put a bean in the middle of that. Then I come to a bean, so I want to put a V-stitch in the top of that. And that's all you do all the way across. If it's a V-stitch, it gets a bean. If it's a bean, it gets a V-stitch, and the top of that bean is always a little bit offset. It'll be just to the right if you're right-handed, just to the left if you're working left-handed. Each side will begin with a bean stitch and end with a bean stitch as you work. So because the last thing in the row before was a V-stitch, chain 2 V-stitch worked into the corner, the first thing you come to will always be a V-stitch, which requires a bean. So your habit is always going to be bean, V, bean, and then you'll come up against your new corner and you work V-stitch, chain 2 V-stitch. It's very straightforward. You just want to keep track of those chain 2 corners. They really helps to use those stitch markers. That way you won't get confused between a corner and a V-stitch. At the end of row 4, each side should have 15 stitches along it, so 3 per V-stitch, 1 per bean stitch. As you leave a corner, the first thing you come to will be a V, it gets a bean. The bean stitch gets a V in the top of it. A V gets a bean, and so on. I'm going to let you work away at that all the way across. Oops, you know what? I half did a double crochet. Try not to do that. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pick up a loop. I have to say it in my head sometimes, just to keep myself from accidentally doing a double crochet or working a cluster, which is like working a half of a double crochet and then a half of a double crochet all into the same stitch. So bean stitches and clusters are different because you're just picking up a whole bunch of loops before you do any actual crocheting when you make a bean stitch. All right, I'll let you guys work away at that. I'll catch up with you back at the beginning. Like every other row, you work your last bean stitch into the last V-stitch. That brings you up to the chain 4 that began. Find the 3rd chain, join with a slip stitch. If you're not changing colors, you slip stitch across to the chain 2 space, meaning you slip stitch into the chain 1 of the V, slip stitch into the top of the double crochet, slip stitch into the chain 2 space. Hold your horses. If you are changing colors, you can fasten off, weave in your tail if you like, or you can leave your tails to be woven in at the end. Grab your new color and join with a slip stitch in the chain 2 space. Row 5, row 6, every row hereafter is exactly the same as row 4. I've joined my new color with a slip stitch in the chain 2 corner space. We chain 4 to begin. Counts as a double crochet, chain 1. double crochet into the corner, and that completes the first V-stitch, chain 2 for the new corner, and double crochet, chain 1, and double crochet for your second V-stitch. Don't forget to put that stitch marker back in the corner. That really does help keep track of the corner and the V-stitches. First thing you come to will be a V-stitch. It gets a bean. Then it's a bean and it gets a V-stitch. And it's the same thing around and around and around. If it's a V-stitch, it gets a bean. If it's a bean, it gets a V. And remember that the top of that bean is just to the right if you're right-handed, just to the left if you're left-handed. When you get to a corner, keep track of those corners with a slip stitch, or a stitch marker, I should say. V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch in the corner. Put your stitch marker back in the chain 2 just to keep track of it. And it's the same thing, around and around and around. I'm going to let you work away at row 5. I will catch up with you at the end and we'll talk stitch counts. Every row finishes the same way. The last thing you make will be a bean stitch in the middle of a V. That'll bring you up to the chain 4 that began the row. Find the third chain, slip stitch to join in that third chain, and if you're changing colors, you can fasten off, join a new color with a slip stitch in the chain 2 space. If you're not changing colors, slip stitch into the middle of the V, slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet, and slip stitch into the chain 2 space. Either way, you all want to start in the chain 2 space. It just makes things easier to keep track of. That is row 5. At the end of row 5, you should have 19 stitches all the way across each side, excluding your chain 2 spaces. V-stitches, you'll have 5 of them. Beans, you'll have 4 of them. That's across each side, and together they all total 19 stitches. That's row 5. We've got one more row to do. Here we go for row 6. You know the drill now. We start with a chain 4 and double crochet into the same space to finish off that first V. Chain 2 for the new corner and V-stitch. And that is the first corner complete. V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch. Stitch marker goes back in. First thing you see will be a V-stitch, and you work a bean into the middle of it. If it's a V-stitch, it gets a bean. If it's a bean stitch, it gets a V. Back to a V-stitch, and we're making a bean. And that's all you do, all the way across each side. Remember, your chain 2 corners get V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch. Put that stitch marker back in place. It'll help keep track of everything. I'm going to let you finish row 6 on your own. I'll catch up with you at the end, and we'll do one last stitch count. When you've finished row 6 or the last row of your square, join with a slip stitch to that third chain of the chain 4. And if you're continuing, you can continue with the same color by slip stitching across and into the chain 2 space. You can fasten off like I am, weave in your tails if you're finished, or if you want to keep going, join a new color with a slip stitch in the chain 2 space and keep going. The pattern is the same throughout. Each side at the end of row 6 will have 23 stitches across it. You'll have 6 V-stitches and 5 bean stitches per side. That's how you know you've completed row 6. If you were to keep going, row 7 would have 7 V-stitches per side and 6 beans. You'll always have 1 less bean per side than you have V-stitches, and the number of V-stitches you have per side will be the same as the row number that you're on. Kind of an easy way to keep track of things. I'm going to weave in all my tails across the back of my square, and the last thing I'm going to do is take out all my stitch markers, pull out my corners, and do a little light blocking with my hand. If you're using a slippery yarn, I recommend cutting nice long tails so that your tails don't want to weave themselves out. And you can make sure that your tails are less likely to weave themselves out by weaving them through stitches back and forth a couple of times. You can trim anything that's left if you feel you've got little tiny itty bitty bits that are kind of not in danger of working themselves out, but you can see from the front, you can trim those little bits. Flip it back over to the right side, and I like to take out my stitch markers and pull out my corners for a nice finished look. I take the corner and I kind of pinch it. I'm pinching the chain twos together. And then I just kind of give it a little bit of light blocking. You of course can block your squares before you join them if you like, or you can just wait till the whole blanket is joined together and block it when you're finished. That's how I like to do it. And that's how I'm going to do it this year. And that is the Bean Garden Granny Square. Little beans growing on little trellises in a garden plot. It's quick, it's simple, it's a relatively fast square because you're just repeating the same pattern over and over again. And it's kind of a nice way to finish off the year, I think. If you'd like to pick up a pattern for today's square, you'll find it in our Etsy shop, and we'll link to that in the description box down below. And as soon as we have the border tutorial out, we will be trying to get the ebook together. So I know some of you wait till the end of the year to pick up all of the patterns in one ebook, and we do try to have that available somewhere in the middle point of December. So the 2024 Granny's Magical Cupboard ebook of patterns will hopefully be out relatively soon. And thank you all for your inquiries about that. That will also be in the Etsy shop, and we'll make a little announcement about that when it's available. But the individual patterns are all available in the shop right now. That is number 12. That's the last square in this year's Granny Square, Granny's Magical Cupboard Calendar Blanket Project. I know I say this every year, but it amazes me how fast a year goes. I love watching these projects come together. They're so much fun to do with you guys. I have enjoyed seeing all of your squares coming in, and I know now that as we are finishing off the blankets, we're going to be getting pictures of everybody's finished squares and finished blankets, I should say. So I'm really looking forward to being able to publish some of those in our community tab. If you are wondering where the community tab is, you can click on the name of our channel. It'll take you to our YouTube channel homepage, and you'll see a bunch of tabs there. Videos, playlists, shorts. One of them says community, and that community tab, if you click on that, will have a whole bunch of posts of photographs that we share from the community, fun things for our channel family, and things for our subscribers too. So be sure to check out the community tab. If you don't, it's a fun place to hang out. Certainly I like to put stuff there. Thank you so much for being a part of this project with us this year. I hope you had fun. I hope your 2024 was enjoyable. I hope you learned something new from one or two or any of these squares, and I hope you enjoy building these squares into other projects of your own in years to come. Have a wonderful rest of your week. We will see you soon for the border tutorial, and we are also going to have a live stream relatively soon on just joining up the last 6. So we do have a video on how to join your squares. If you haven't started, we'll link that in the description box down below as well, so you can pop over and check that out if you want to start joining all your squares together if you haven't already started. And like I said, we're going to have a little live stream where we finish them off, and if this is sometime in the future, you'll see the link to that live stream in the description box down below as well. All right, I will see you guys very soon. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Until next time, stay safe, stay crafty, and have a great week. Bye guys.
Hi everybody, Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.